welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mac.
Well, hello, and welcome again to From the Biblical Files of Dr. Mac. I am your host, Dr. Mac. We're going to continue our series today of Blacks in the Bible with a focus on Shelosmith and Moses as part one. And the second part of it, we'll talk about a mother's plea for justice for her mixed-race black son. Now, the author we're going to focus again will be Moses, who is traditionally credited as the author of the book of Leviticus, which is the third book of the Old Testament. Now, through its pages, we see God's blueprint for the holiness of his people and the sacrificial system that was installed. The book of Leviticus serves as a manual for the Israelites' worship and community life, centering on holiness of God and the call for his people to emulate his holiness. If you notice, I've used holiness 4 times, so that's a major theme with us. In the book of Leviticus, we have outlines for sacrificial offerings, dietary laws, rituals for purification, moral and ethical conduct, and the sacred feasts, thereby providing a comprehensive guide for the Israelites in both their religious practices and their everyday living. Leviticus emphasizes the significance of purity, atonement, reverence, and moral integrity, and nurturing the profound and devoted relationship with God. It was the answer to all of their problems. Now, it is not an easy book to read, but it is an impressive one as you go through it. In fact, it suffers from the bad reputation of being difficult to read. It is a legal document, and it is similar to legal documents of the ancient Near East, wherein the content is sometimes mixed, and the mixture includes both the civic, the cultural, the religious, the moral, the criminal, the family, and ritual law. So, getting in, you will either be inspired or you'll be frustrated. It concerns with law in a measured tone, and it's less inspirational than, say, Deuteronomy. Even so, its style is not the mind-numbing legalistic one that is popularly assumed. That said, Leviticus makes less sense if taken from the wider biblical context. Exodus is incomplete without Leviticus, and Leviticus presupposes much of what is written there, including the Exodus, the story of the wilderness, the giving of the law, and the building of the tabernacle. It's so close, in fact, and that it sort of opens with words concerning the Lord's filling the tabernacle with his glory, which is found at the end of the book of Exodus. It is a basic book of humanity, if you boil it down to its simplest form. It reveals what is possible to us through the Spirit of God. As usual, let's take a look at the structure of Leviticus, which is divided into 3 parts. Chapters 1 through 7 explain 5 types of ritual sacrifice. Chapters 8 through 15 detail the priestly qualifications and ritual purity. Chapters 16 through 27 outline annual feasts, moral goodness, and Israel covenant faithfulness. Now it is in chapter 24, verses 10 through 23, that we will focus on today, because it is a book of rules. They believed that you had to follow these rules, according to the Israelites, in order to be close to their God. And that is why it is sort of the foundation of books, the writings found in the Torah. Now, when we get to Leviticus 23 and 27, we come to a climactic end in a way that you may or may not be expecting, but you get an emphasis on folk tradition and the Jubilee and the priestly answer to the socio-economic problems of their time. I mention that because many scholars believe that within Leviticus we find concepts of social justice, criminal justice, and the Bible code. So let's take a look at where we are. As I said earlier, we're going to be talking from Leviticus 24, 10, verses 10 through 23, and we're going to talk about Shelosmith's son who committed blasphemy and was stoned to death. It is the story of a certain man whose name is never given. He was the son of an Israelite mother, Shelomith, who was the daughter of Debri of the tribe of Dan. Now, I took time to go through that because you will see that each one of these parts of her name has something to do with the outcome of the story. Now, the question is often asked is, why is this story? You have all of these laws being given, and then all of a sudden the writer stops, Moses stops, and we get into this story. But basically, it demonstrates the story of a young man whom is considered, and I find it derogatory, a half-breed. He's half Egyptian and half Israeli. And there must have been hundreds of young people who were of mixed heritage in the camp. Only he was singled out to tell his story because it's connected to his mother. This doesn't mean that there's something inherently wrong with the situation. We're not making judgments, but what we want to focus on is what's called a spiritual conflict within the story. So, in the scriptures of Israel, we have a picture of the Spirit at work within us, of the new life, the redeemed life, while Egypt is always a picture of a world of the old life. And here is someone who is trying to mix the two, trying to live halfway between the two. The son is trying to conduct his business affairs, perhaps by the laws of Egypt, by the ways of the world, and he is also trying to mix in the world view an outlook of God. And when that happens, there's always trouble. So we want to stop and go back up to Leviticus 19, verse 15. It says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Now, we get back into the rationale for the blasphemer's death sentence that's given in Leviticus 24, because it allows us to see that this point in time, this had to be followed. It was already given, but some things get changed as we go. Now, it serves a purpose because the principle is foundational in the Mosaic law, which is, I am the Lord, and it's often repeated, whether it's a moral law or it's ceremonial regulation. I am the law. I am God. I am holy. But this son of Shelomith is one of those mixed multitudes who had followed in the flight from Egypt, which we talked about earlier in Exodus 12, verse 38. And he blasphemed the name of the Lord. If such blasphemy were to go unpunished, the obligation of law would be dissolved. So it was necessary that something be done. When we look at the commentators, Lang said, a community which suffers the reviling of the principles of their community without reaction is morally fallen to pieces. So he is brought before Moses, who is to pronounce judgment. And this gets to be where we get the interesting part of the of the story. So when that happens, Moses does not give a specific judgment on the man, and he decides that he's going to let God decide what the punishment will be. And if you read carefully, you'll see the specific judgment that was given to the young man is that he shall die by stoning at the hands of the congregation, after the witnesses of his sin had laid their hands upon his head, and a general law is founded on this case. So as those who say I witnessed it, they put their hands on their head. That's a gesture, according to background information, that sort of transferred his sin away from them. You know, they were superstitious in nature. But this young man had gotten in the quarrel with someone in the camp, and in the heat of anger, please notice we're dealing with anger management here. In the heat of anger and passion, he blurted out what was deep inside him and deep inside his thoughts and had been hidden before. There's a Latin phrase says, in wine there is truth. It is also true that in anger there is truth. When someone is angry, the person will say something that they would never say otherwise. Usually it is something they would like to have said but didn't say or do. So in this book of Leviticus, which is the center of the 5 books written by Moses, you get to take a look at the heart of the Old Testament law. Now, portions of the law teach the holiness God required of his people. Other portions teach the forgiveness God offers to restore sinners to holiness. That is a major theme, and we'll just outline it as such when we discuss the sin portion of it. But a major focus of Leviticus is on atonement. God has a provision in his heart for forgiveness. So it may be difficult to read some of the writings because of the translations of the ancient rituals and rules, but keep in mind it all leads to God's forgiveness. So we have a rich lesson in atonement. So as we go through, let's take a look at this. We are going to take a look at, again, we've talked about the themes so far. We know that holiness is one. We know that sacrifice is one. 2 major themes. Then under that, God's care for the poor and the vulnerable and the mistreated, and faithfulness to the covenant. We talked about the covenant last time. We'll be talking about the covenant for the next 2 books. And then there's a remembrance of who God was and who God is. What's the power of a name? And then God's requirement for the Israelites to remain holy so that he can dwell within their midst. Do you remember the care that was taken with the construction of the tabernacle and all of the laws that were given? So it is interesting to note that this principle that God laid down as a basis of judgment in civil as in religious offices was that the punishment should be in proportion to the crime. The punishment should be in proportion to the crime. So this is not a matter of revenge. What we're about to take a look at is a matter of retribution. It should never take the form of revenge and was never to be in excess of the wrong that had been done. So we'll see a little bit go back into Exodus And this is even before they're in the wilderness here. So the identification of the woman and her son as part of the mixed multitude that went with Moses out of Egypt, we have to understand that the offender's father apparently chose to remain in Egypt. Now, a little aside here, he could have come with them, the Egyptian could have come with them, and he could have, it's called matrilocal, he could have lived with them in the mother's tribe of Dan, but he chose to stay in Egypt. And this is something that was in each of the pieces that was done for research. The paganism of the father was continued in the son. So this is a tragic pattern that usually occurs in the lives of Christian women who marry unbelievers. As an Egyptian, he would have been a participant of their polytheistic gods, including Ra and others. This must surely be the reason God was commanded that the believers should not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So we have that as an underlying theme also. Let's go on. Retribution is a principal goal of the quote unquote penal system in the Bible. Retribution, not revenge. Now, the setting for our story today is in the plain of the Sinai Peninsula, because they're camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. Now, the reason for this appearance of this is really enables Moses to have a teachable moment. As an old teacher, I can say that a situation arises, and at that point, you can not only give the law verbally, but the people can participate and remember what happened. Therefore, the law becomes ingrained in their thinking. So, the reason the people didn't know what to do about this offender who blasphemed against God is because it hadn't happened before, because everything was God is holy. The name, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. That was it. They had no idea. They had no preconceived notion. They had nothing to do this. So Moses used this time to get this message over to them. So, but Moses didn't really decide. What did he do? He turned it over to the Lord for the Lord to give it to everyone. So, in this thought-provoking passage, what we encounter is a scenario involving a young man, and I'm going to say of mixed heritage. I refuse to say the half-breed thing. He was the son of the Israelite mother, and I keep saying it over and over because it is important. And the Egyptian father representing a blend of different cultures, backgrounds, and belief systems. Now, he and the other man who fought in the camp, there's nothing really given to say, okay, why was this fight? Why did it occur? But I'll share a couple of points from different sources as we go through. Mary Fairchild defines blasphemy as an act of showing contempt, insulting, or expressing a lack of reverence. Now, that was just not to be done in there. It just was not to be done. The blasphemy in the Old Testament means that it was an insult to the honor of God. They were attacking directly or mocking indirectly. Blasphemy then becomes what? The opposite of praise. And once again, the penalty for blasphemy in the Old Testament was death by stoning. Now, in the New Testament, it becomes something else because Jesus paid the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. But do remember, as we go through, blasphemy here is a serious sin. And as we go through, we have to remember that a name is not simply a label. The use of this name is not just a label. That the name was chosen carefully that meant something, and the name was symbolic, and it represented the people, a person, and its character. So God's name was holy, so you didn't just blurt it out. His name was removed from scriptures and replaced with the unpronounceable substitute of Yahweh. so that it could not be uttered in vain. But remember, the young man is angry, and we'll talk about his anger, and you get to decide whether he's justified or not. So God's name was replaced, and it is completely sacred, and it is used in praise to him, but not in a blasphemous manner. So he is I am. He is the Father, the Creator, the Savior, the Redeemer, the Comforter, the King of Kings, the Almighty, our Prince of Peace, our joy, our strength, our rock, and we go over and over. There are approximately more than 250 names ascribed to the Lord. Therefore, to defame his name is to defame him. Israel was so appalled at the young man's sin that they took him to Moses, and that's verses 12 through 24. They describe it. Now, there are those who say that the young man did not use the Lord's name, but he used the name of one of the Egyptians' god in his anger. Well, still, he defamed a deity. So, again, that was not something that was to be done, but specifically, you were not to use the Lord's name. And we're just going to assume, as in the King James Version, he defamed the name of God. So in the 15th verse, we continue and we find out that Moses was going to render a judgment of punishment for this person who did that. And we go on as we look through and try to see necessarily the point of view through the characters who are in this episode. So we have God, we know who he is. We have Moses, we know pretty much, we're comfortable now. He is no longer the Jewish child raised by the Egyptian. He is no longer a prince of Egypt. He is no longer, and we're talking about Moses, he is no longer the murderer who killed, and this becomes important a little bit later in this story. He's no longer the one who decided single-handedly that he would take up for the Jews, Israelites, as he saw one fighting to the other. He's no longer just the fugitive who marries the father's two children and goes down to Egypt to ask Pharaoh to let his people go. He is now the judge. He is now the judge, the the uncontested leader of the people at the camp in Mount Sinai. We have Aaron. We won't really talk about him today, but he's a major character in the book of Leviticus. But we get down to Shelosmith, whose name means peaceful, and it tells us she's Van David, which means her father's name was David, but she was also from the tribe of Dan. And the name of the offender is not given. And that could be because there's a universality associated with that. So it is one where you would think a woman who's going to be peaceful, but in turn, and the last name Devad means to speak, but it doesn't work out that way. It becomes something that is rather tragic instead. Yeah, it means to judge, and the judgment that's passed on to her son is not a good judgment. So as we go through and we look at what we have, we also need to sort of highlight this part about the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan goes back to Moses' son, Grisham, and their religion and their practice of priesthood differed greatly from the Levites, in the book of Leviticus. So Willis C. Gaffrey identifies Shelomith as a woman from the tribe of Dan, the only woman mentioned in the book of Leviticus, a mother and a possible victim. So we're going to be able to move that over. Gaffrey, for those of you who wondering, is a black womanist or feminist, and she writes that Shelomith is the mother of a child who is accused, rightly or wrongly, of a crime, imprisoned, and executed. So, where do we find more about her? Well, we're going to look in our scriptures today, and we've already talked about what her name means. We've already talked about what her tribe meant. So let's take a look at a rabbi's tribute to the blasphemer's mother, and that's done by Rabbi Wendy Zergler. So she's reflecting on a Mother's Day situation, and she thinks about the fact that Sulamite's name is mentioned in the Torah, which is an honor. That was an honor left for people like Rebecca, women like Rebecca, and the other great women of the Jewish faith. So she goes on to describe this situation with the mixed heritage and how the child could have been, and Shelomit could have been, an outsider, very much an outsider. So if we look at verse 10, we find out that she is of the tribe and could have been further prominent. Um, we have all kinds of theories going on. We don't know. One version says she's married, another version says she's not. But in verse 11, um, when Yahweh speaks to Moses, he tells Moses to take the blasphemer outside of the camp because the incident occurs inside of the camp. And he let those who, put their hands on the head and the whole community stone him. So you get the impression right away, they were outsiders in a way. The story is not one of great community, but it is one that identifies her as an outsider. As we go through, we see that in one version of the story, she is married, and an Egyptian who is the taskmaster, because she is peaceful, she is sociable, she is chatty. In some instances, she's referred to as a flirt. But he sees her, and she's very pleasant, and she smiles at him. And this guy comes through, and he picks up all of the men who were going to work, and he picks up her husband. And when her husband leaves, he goes back and he assaults her. That's one version of the story. And we're not saying that it's not the right version because there's so many of it. But we're trying to get the origin of the son who is not named. But you have to remember that the excessive friendliness of the mother was a bad reflection on her indiscriminate associations, and the chattiness that's associated with her. There's another version of it where the taskmaster is not picking them up, but he comes in after the taskmaster has taken them, he comes back to the tent, and Shulamit is asleep, so he assaults her. Either way, the result is pregnancy, and there we have a son who's half Egyptian in lineage. So if we go on and we look at this, we get where some of the rabbis wrote of her not as a flirt, but as a harlot, as a strumpet, all of these derogatory things. She would have had no control over any of that, other than the fact that she's friendly, that she could have controlled that. But whether the taskmaster came back after the husband left immediately, or whether he came later when she was asleep, either way, she had no power really. She had no way of saying no to the assault. But she becomes, for many of us, a symbol of a struggling single mother. In either case, she is a symbol of a struggling single mother. So she would have had, and she bore this Egyptian man's child, and the Bible offers no details how the son came to be born and raised in the tribe of Dan. Please note, he is raised in the tribe of his mother, which is as it was traditionally practiced while they were in Egypt, and even later. And that's really why the fight occurs. It occurs because of we're getting to the tribe of Dan. So, as a struggling mother, she and her son decided to take a walk, and it's not clear. Um, they are in the peninsula here, and they walk out during the camp. And you don't learn until a little bit later that there's been a bit of contention because had she been raped, and it appears so, then she would have been shot. Had she been married to the Egyptian who just refused to come, that would have been a different story. But all we're told in the story is that she and her son decided to take a walk out in the tent. And it doesn't say just a walk, they strolled out. So she's not holding her head down. And he's, by several accounts, all he wants to do is to move his tent from where the mixed, the mixed race families are to the tribe of Dan because he feels he has a right to be in that setting at the tribe of Dan. And he had taken this, he had been told no because he'd taken this before to the court, and Moses had denied it. But he not understanding his mother is a full Israelite, but the guy that he's fighting with reminds him that you are not a full Israelite. You are part Egyptian, so you have no right to be here. So immediately we have to remember that Moses has some mixed things going on. Even the name Moses is Egyptian, but he fights. And then one of the older versions goes into saying that, you know what, your mama was, really basically the translation says your mother was a whore. And that brings on a fight. If you grew up in a neighborhood like mine, those were fighting words anyway. You didn't even have to say the whole statement. You just had to say your mama. And there would be fists flying and sometimes teeth flying. You just didn't do that. In either case, he fought. And while he was fighting, he cursed. And he used the name, according to King James Bible here, he used the name of the Lord in vain. So, if any man strikes any human being, he shall suffer, he shall surely be put to death. So, we have this blasphemy now getting mixed in with the bloodshed, and he's taken back. Actually, there's one translation said that it was so startling when he used the word that everybody close by in the camp became quiet. But they captured him and took him to Moses, and Moses is saying, okay, no. Now, I don't want to get into the other story where Moses said yes when the daughters of a man who died in the wilderness came and asked for their portion. Uh, and he granted that. And that was through the line of the father. Okay? But here we're talking about the only rights that this unnamed son has is through the line of the mother. So he's taken into custody, and Shulamith is just left. There's nothing she can really do at this point because the decision is going to be made by Moses. It's a really interesting story, and if you go and watch each of the translations of the different words, you can understand why he fought. But there's also uh, the other character in the story. We have to remember that here is a boy, and the boy is unnamed, and you have to remember that that makes him an outsider, that makes him a foreigner. We've talked about a foreigner before, and that was Hagar. Here we have a young foreigner who wants to claim part of his heritage, and he's being denied. What else do we know about the boy? That's really it. That's really it. We don't really get to know anything more about the son, other than he fought, he was angry that he was not being given what he felt was rightfully his because his mom was of the tribe of Dan, and by that he felt his Israeli portion of his heritage should have been upheld. Now, is there anything else that we can talk about here that Um, his otherness is referred to as his otherness by most of the commentators. He just is not part of it. To be outside, to be the other, is not good. There is a section where an Israeli writer, Robin Cohen, wrote about him, how she felt that he handled things as he was going about. He drew attention to himself, but you have to remember we have these holes in the story because you don't know what to do and you're going from one source to the other source in order to get it done. So he doesn't know if his dad raped his mom or if she was one of the Israelite girls who married, to sort of help her family. Um, was she shamed or what? We don't know. It's a hole in the story. But it seems that the son would have had a harder time. In Egypt, he was considered a slave, okay? And here he is outside in the wilderness, and he's still not considered part of anything. He's not part of anything. So we go through, and the question is, was there marriage at his birth? We don't really know because each time there's a translation difference, there's no clarity regarding that. But she's a single mother, her son's in trouble, and all she's doing is waiting for the um, the judgment of Moses. There's not a whole lot she can do. Now, the Egyptians were admitted into the congregation after the third generation out there in the wilderness, and there was no edict against mixed marriages until later, because there were, like I said, there were hundreds of them in the camp. But this young man felt that he did deserve what he should have gotten, but instead he gets imprisoned or held in custody. In prison or held in custody. So when the verdict comes down, we read it earlier, take him outside of the camp. Take him outside, And I thought immediately, since Easter just passed, I thought about the crucifixion. They took Jesus outside of the city up to Golgotha's hill, for the crucifixion. The thing sort of like, I don't want this bad stuff inside, where we're supposed to be doing things, but this was done outside of the camp. Nothing more is said about Shunammite after this point, where she lived, how long she lived. None of that is given. We're not given anything. Then the whole focus of the passage turns to the law, and this becomes the moral law, the things that will justify. We already had so many of them, but here we get a whole new set of laws about what should happen, and that becomes known, as the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, fracture for a fracture, and animal for if an animal is injured, you have to pay for the animal or give another animal of the same kind, even down to the unblemished animals that needed to be used for the sacrifice. You get all of that in there, but nothing more about Shunammite and her son after the stoning. The stoning does occur. It does occur. And the lesson is made, the lesson becomes not only that teachable moment, but it becomes the reality because out of it becomes that law. And out of those laws, now keep in mind, there was already, and we talked about it when we talked about Abraham, we already had the code of Hammurabi, and some of those things were already in there. But this law of retaliation based on the holiness code became the law for the Israelites at that point. So how does that transfer to where we are now? Well, I sort of like Gaffney's approach to this, because here is a woman who actually becomes a single woman who's trying to raise her child best she can, and he being who he is, who feels he has rights, who feels he's being trampled upon, He's given a nickname of an Egyptian pharaoh by the kids. His skin stands out against the other kids. He is reddish brown, therefore he's considered black. So, and his father apparently didn't care enough to come with them. So he's an outsider trying to stand up. We're never given his age. We're never told that he's a boy. But if he's fighting an Egyptian man, I see him as more of a young man, a man who wants to stand up for himself and his mom. The laws that are given, they are all based on the fact that the punishment must fit the crime, and it has to be fair and equal within the society. And as we go through and we read this, it's not gonna, come out that way. And a sermon was given a few years ago, um, by a pastor who was a former teacher, and I understand that. Being in given a class of students who were very unruly boys who were just exceedingly unruly. The sermon is bad kids in the Bible. And he said something one day to them that was rather blasphemous. And they stayed in the classroom, true enough. But as he reflected on it, he realized how wrong he was, because he basically just made a decision and that was it. And later, he goes on and he's willing to admit that God has forgiven him, for being hasty in that decision, just the accusation, I'm looking at these kids and this is it, so they're already bad, so, they're not going anywhere, they're not doing anything. But that transfers into our concept of social justice, our concept of capital punishment, criminal justice. And before we go today, I wanted to share in the line with you an article from the Washington Post, and it very much a contemporary transference of what what happened with the blasphemer. We have, and I want to make sure I get the name of the article just right. Her son killed by police. A black mother reluctantly becomes an advocate. And the story is by Olivia Diaz. It's an 8-minute read, and it is again, as I said, from the Washington Post. What we have here is a mother who's sitting out on a bench in North Beach, Maryland, when two sheriff deputies passed by, and she sat there and she just called them, and she was grieving, and she introduced herself, and she started to tell them what had happened to her son. Her son is a young black man. Who was in a situation that was treacherous to begin with. Uh, but you got to remember um, the situation that we've had, some of the situations that we've had in the past. And he was one of those, but he wasn't like a famous one of those. There was no famous dignitaries to attend his funeral or to make his speech. It's just his grandmother and the family, his grandmother, his mother. Um, his name wasn't out there in big press. The mom said, Miss Johnson said, that he wanted everyone to know his name. He wanted to be important, and he did things that he thought would get him important. He was convicted of stealing a car with his friends. He was convicted of, he had an addiction. He struggled with addiction. He was arrested in connection with a misdemeanor charge, not in Maryland, but also in D.C. Um, Almost 3 weeks later, there was a knock on her door, and there were detectives there, and she knew immediately what was going to be done. We said, who were there to tell her that the son had been killed. He was running away. He went into a wooded area, and these these law officers who were there, and he was saying, I'm not trying, I don't have a gun, I don't have a weapon, and he was bending down to give up, and he was shot. Now, What happened with that is that the body cam were released, and his mom, Miss Johnson, was able to see it. So she said that the police chief who came out, that how they do, came out and willfully vilified her son, by going back over his record, everything that he had done wrong, which had been done. He was shot by the Fairfax police near Tyson's Corner. They call it Tyson's Mall, but it's Tyson's Corner. But the body cam showed all that he was trying to give up, and that he was um, after all those things, he was trying to give up, and he knew that he was going to be killed at this point. He was aware. So mom was protesting. Mrs. Johnson is protesting, and members of the community were protesting also. Um, but the question was, why does it have to be this way? Why does it continuously have to be this way? Is there no way that we can get the social justice that was given to the ancient Israelites? Is there no way that we can't understand the eye for an eye that existed? Willa Cather was right in a way. Willa Gaffrey was right in a way when she said that we have to start seeing our sons and daughters and not as marginalized citizens, but persons who deserve the same rights as everyone else. We want to make sure they stay within the confines of the law, but when something does step off and it's wrong, we need to be able to pull them back and remind them that God forgives. God forgives all. But now we have to pray for the rest of it to come about. We have to pray that the standards are going to be equal for everyone. We have to pray that the forgiveness is something that's just there. It's not something that we have to continue to ask for, but know when to use it and how to use it. I know the stories are centuries apart, but as I read it, there was no way that I could make the connection between what happens now to a child who needs the justice and what happened then. We got the law. We're going back to that Leviticus 24, 10 through 23 to get the law. Now we need to practice the law. I told you earlier how difficult the book of Exodus is to get through, and I just chose a section of it. But it is actually the first book that young Jewish kids read. It is one of, as difficult as it is, it's one of them for them to read, because they want, the rabbis within their religion want them to know the law. I am not saying that we need to put our children into the you need to read this book kind of mode, but somehow we have to develop a balance between justice and mercy. The Shulamite son allows us to see that balance between justice and mercy. Although they appear to be at opposite ends, justice makes sure that everyone is rewarded for his righteousness and punished for his unrighteousness. Justice demands that these rewards and punishment reflect the measure of devotion or lack of devotion to obedience of God's law. Thus, justice seems to be something which will condemn the sinner and award the saint. However, will there be moments of virtue? No virtue can erase the wrong each of us has done. Ultimately, we stand guilty under a strict justice system. I would hope that you would go back and that you would read the story of Shelosmith's son, and not try to get angry, but to say, okay, there's something there. There's something there. Should his mom have been, regardless of what happened to her, regardless of how she was conceived, is there something more that the mom could have done? Is there something more that Moses and the community could have done? Because remember, Moses was a fugitive. Moses was a murderer. Therefore, he was a fugitive. And he is punished later, but not now. Later, over in Numbers, book of Numbers, he's punished. What are we to do with Scripture? There's always a lesson. So we go through and we look at justice, a plea for justice from this mom, Mrs. Johnson, who simply wanted, she's protesting because she simply wanted justice for her son. The justice that the two policemen would be punished. One is going to trial, and one was just put on administrative leave. Is that justice? I'm not sure. But we do look for that balance between justice and mercy. Now, there are so many things that we can say and so many things that we can do, but we have to work on ourselves and we have to work in a way that corporate situations will change. The overall situation. You don't want to be like so many of us. When you hear of a crime, the first thing I say, I hope it wasn't a black kid because I know the justice system is going to be skewed. I'm sure that it's going to be skewed. So we can pray a prayer that simply asks, teach us how to live this way by the power of your spirit within us. Help us to understand that it isn't our dedication, concentration, or the effort which is going to do it. It is our understanding that we can't do a thing without you, that you must enable us if we are going to be what you want us to be. Now, Lord, little by little, line by line, precept by precept, please make that come clear to us because we are tired of living defeated lives, lives filled with conflict and pressure, unresolved, and the anxieties that we are tired of living these defeated lives and engaging in the hostilities, the resentment, and the bitterness that they bring. We want to be your men and your women as you designed us to be. So thank you for the possibilities in Jesus Christ. And in his name we pray. Amen. Please join me next week as we take a look in the book of Numbers and we continue to talk about blacks in the Bible. Please note that today Shelosmith was not black, but her son was of mixed heritage. Therefore, this story fits within my file box. Thank you so much for joining me.